And a bit like advertisement says, lubes ain't lubes, oils ain't oils. Sometimes the choice of lubricant can be a problem. So some of the examples I've come across during my career in aviation were as follows. With SkyWest Aviation, I was contacted by the senior base engineer, one of our lamies, at the Cairns Coast Watch base. They had a search master there, and it was in the hangar for some routine maintenance. And on rotating one of the propellers, a lamie heard some clattering noise that didn't sound normal. So he removed the spinner. He found some of the mounting bolt heads had snapped off and were hanging by the lock wire. What they found was some cracking. Some of the cracking enough to take the heads right off. So the propeller was removed and use of the bolts did. And it probably would have been a catastrophic event if that propeller had come off in flight. So the bolts were then forwarded to me in Perth, and at that stage I was the engineering standards manager for SkyWest Aviation. And being an ex-CA airworthiness officer, I still had some reasonable working relationships with some of the CA technicians, particularly in this instance with the blokes in the materials laboratory in Canberra, DCA through to CA. We're the only civil aviation regulator in the world who had their own independent materials laboratory, which is really quite an advantage in ensuring truthful, unbiased opinion. Another story about that. The bolts were submitted to CA by the local office into the mandatory defect reporting system. Now, the technician had a look at the failed bolts under a scanning electron microscope and determined that the failures were as a result of hydrogen embrittlement of the steel. As normally associated with electroplating of steel parts, such as with cadmium or chromium. But these were not new or freshly plated bolts. That's what you usually find bolts failing in the industry from that. So he had a look at the chemistry of the environment the bolts were operating in. Firstly, he observed that the protective cadmium plating had been worn off these bolts because the propellers used to be off and on those nomads on a very regular basis for various reasons. And the threads, they were lubricated with a standard propeller bolt lubricant, which is a molybdenum disulfide base grease. But being used in coast watch operations, these nomads were often flown at low level over the ocean in what is termed a marine environment, which just means it's loaded with salt. And the theory is that there was a chemical reaction between the grease and the chromium and the chloride in the salt, resulting in the production of atomic particles of hydrogen gas. And as we all know, steel is porous to a degree, and the atoms of hydrogen were absorbed into the metal, resulting condition known as hydrogen embrittlement. So that reached the point that the bolts failed. So our immediate fix, of course, was replace all the propeller mount bolts on our 3 Coastwatch aircraft. We had another problem with a Nomad aircraft operating out of Darwin, and I'm not sure if it was an N22 or one of the N24 aircraft. But that doesn't matter because the back end's the same. The horizontal stabiliser hinge bolt appeared to be wearing out between inspections, which were 120 hours apart. That's flying gas. Now, there's an aircraft with a reputation for a twitchy tailplane at the best of time, so it caught our attention. Especially manufactured bolts of a relatively small diameter. So again, I sent those bolts to the materials laboratory in CA in Canberra through the mandatory defect reporting system via the local office. And I had a phone call from the technician there telling me that he'd had a look at these bolts under a powerful microscope, not an electron one, and he noted that there were flakes of copper on the bolt. And it turned out the lamie who'd installed the bolts at the previous check had a tube of copper coat lubricant in his toolbox. And in general aviation, this is a lubricant is usually only used on spark plugs. Now the Lamy had decided to he'd use that lubricant on these Nomad bolts. And again, this was a problem because in the marine environment around Darwin, the reaction of the copper in the chloride environment, salt environment, caused the cadmium plating to be sacrificial and erode away. So like a little battery. And so that wearing that cadmium away made the bolts sloppy fit. So although it's an excellent lubricant, copper coat is definitely not the lubricant to be used in that environment. And so it's usually only used in high temperature applications such as the spark plugs. And I'm not sure these days what the Nomad maintenance manual calls up for lubricant of those bolts, but I'm sure as hell it's not copper coat. Now, Pasquale Pearls bought Skywest Aviation, and Mr. Pasquale had a working relationship with an operator of Metro 3 heavy aircraft out of Brisbane. And one day in Perth we had a call that one of that operator's Metro 3s, Metro 3 heavy, had shed a main wheel on takeoff out of Port Hedland. The wheel was collected and forwarded to us in Perth. And one of the good things that operator did was he always carried a spare main wheel in the rear cargo compartment. So our Broome-based Lamy flew down to wherever the aircraft next landed, which I believe was Karratha, and fixed the aircraft. But fortunately, the Metro aircraft has dual wheels on a common axle. So landing minus a wheel was not a major drama, and the aircraft was lightly loaded, so there was no axle damage. What the Lamy found was that the axle nut was still correctly pinned in place on the axle, but the wheel bearing closest to the axle nut had collapsed and shed all the rollers out of the assembly. So all this part around here, that cage and all these rollers, had all disappeared. That allowed the wheel to migrate completely off the axle and eventually detach from the aircraft. And it appeared that it was from lack of lubricant. There were signs of serious overheating on the remaining bearing components. And it turns out the wheel bearing grease used by that operator, not used by SkyWest or Pearl, was the red coloured stuff. It was quite a legal wheel bearing grease, however apparently a bit susceptible to water contamination. And bearing in mind it's about 20 years back, the specifications may have improved outside. What had happened, the company pilots were required to make sure their aircraft were kept clean, particularly of mud on the landing gear. And it would appear that being enthusiastic, they'd managed over a period of time to wash the grease out of this particular wheel bearing, resulting in the bearing failure and the loss of the wheel. Fortunately, there was no other damage occurred to the aircraft or on the ground from the escaping main wheel. So another interesting experience we had with SkyWest was in compliance with a directive to replace a number of bolts, tapered pin bolts in the Nomad structure. So in the manufacturer's service document, a particular lubricant was specified, and we asked our procurement bloke, our storeman, to get us some. And he came back and asked how much did we really need. It was only available in 200 litre containers, and from the price he was being quoted, it must have had gold dust in it. So we queried Government Aircraft Factory technical people in Melbourne and asked why that particular grease. And the tech rep followed up with the design engineer for the modification, and he just looked up one of the oil company lubrication handbooks, and he picked out a grease that sounded like it had the desired properties. But being an academic engineer, he didn't bother with the practicalities of availability or cost. But I'm not sure how many tapered pins there were per aircraft, might have been 4, but the volume of the lubricant required was minuscule. And it was bad enough we had to have the tapered reamers manufactured to do the job, and we just purchased the total Australian stock of that size taper pins for our Nomads. The other Nomad operators had to get their taper pins from overseas. Anyway, GAF reviewed their decision and gave us a revised lubricant specification that was readily available. for us to use. So the rules of the game that you must comply with the manufacturer's maintenance instructions. But in the case of the Nomad modification, we decided to query the lubricant specified, and the manufacturer revised their data for the particular modification. In these days, the specification for lubricant to be used in servicing your aircraft is in Chapter 12 of the Maintenance Manual, and for some older aircraft, it's sometimes in a section in the Pilot's Operating Handbook or the Flight Manual. In most instances, aircraft manufacturers will nominate the various lubricants, including engine oil, by specification number, rather than by the lubricant manufacturer's trade name or number. But your maintenance provider can advise you what lubricants meet the manufacturer's data. The Nomad photographs were provided by Jeffrey Goodall from his extensive library of Australian aircraft, and if you're looking for any information on the Australian aircraft, it's a good place to start with on your Google. So thank you for listening to my anecdote.